Everything is wrong!
You're not alone. I'm still here and I won't go away no matter how loud it gets.
No babysitter lasted with the Marine as twins until a female veteran showed up. The front door slammed so hard that 6-year-old twins Emma and Ethan Eldridge barely flinched from their fortress built of overturned furniture and couch cushions. They'd heard that sound 15 times in the past 8 months. Another babysitter, giving up another adult who couldn't handle the nightmares, the rage, and the desperate clinging that came with children whose mother had died in a car accident while their Marine father was deployed to Syria. "I can't do this anymore," screamed Mrs. Patterson, the latest casualty in the Eldridge family's war against stability. "Those kids aren't children, they're feral animals. Someone needs to call social services because I've never seen behavior like this." What Mrs. Patterson didn't know was that Sergeant Sarah Collins, U.S. Army retired, was already walking up the front steps, her own invisible wounds hidden beneath the calm exterior of someone who'd treated trauma casualties in Afghanistan. The woman who'd saved Marines under fire was about to discover that her greatest mission wasn't overseas. It was right here with 2 broken children who would teach her how to heal herself. Millbrook, North Carolina, 25, the military town of 15,000 residents, was built around Camp Lejeune, where Marine families created tight-knit communities that understood deployment stress. But even military spouses struggled with children whose trauma exceeded their experience and training. The Eldridge house on Semper Fi Street had become notorious among babysitters and daycare centers, a beautiful colonial that housed beautiful children whose psychological wounds made them nearly impossible to manage. Sergeant First Class James Eldridge embodied the impossible choices that military service demanded of family men. His second deployment to Syria, coming just 6 months after his wife Rebecca's death in a drunk driving accident that had shattered more than glass and metal. The Marine reconnaissance specialist, whose leadership had earned him 2 Bronze Stars, found himself powerless against enemy forces of grief, guilt, and the kind of helplessness that came from being 8,000 miles away when his children needed him most. 6-year-old twins Emma and Ethan carried trauma that manifested in ways that civilian caregivers couldn't understand or manage. Emma's hypervigilance made her scan every room for threats, while her brother's explosive rages could turn routine bedtime into 3-hour battles that left babysitters emotionally drained and professionally defeated. Their PTSD symptoms included night terrors, separation, anxiety, regression to younger behaviors, and the kind of testing that pushed every adult boundary to breaking point. Their behavior wasn't malicious, but defensive children whose world had collapsed were determined to control whatever remained, even if that meant driving away every caregiver who tried to help them. The fortress building was literal and metaphorical, creating physical barriers that represented their psychological walls against further abandonment and loss. Staff Sergeant Sarah Collins carried her own invisible wounds from 18 months as a combat medic in Afghanistan, where her battlefield medical station had treated everything from IED casualties to psychological breakdowns among soldiers whose minds couldn't process the horrors they'd witnessed. At 32, she possessed the clinical training to recognize trauma, while carrying enough of her own to understand how it felt from the inside. Her transition to civilian life had been challenging in ways that her military service had never prepared her for: the nightmares, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness that made forming relationships difficult, while civilian employment felt meaningless after saving lives under fire. Her decision to work in childcare wasn't career choice, but therapy-seeking purpose that could translate her medical training to healing that didn't involve combat zones. The Millbrook military community had exhausted conventional childcare solutions for the Eldridge twins, with professional agencies, military family services, and church volunteer networks all failing to provide sustainable care for children whose needs exceeded standard training and patience. The Family Readiness Group had organized meal trains and offered support, but actual child care required specialized understanding that civilian providers couldn't develop and military spouses couldn't maintain long-term. The broader context was a military system that provided extensive support for deployed service members while offering limited resources for families dealing with complex trauma that civilian institutions weren't equipped to handle. The twins' needs intersected military deployment stress, childhood grief, and PTSD symptoms that required therapeutic intervention beyond what babysitting services could provide. Sarah's arrival represented both last resort and divine intervention for a family whose options were narrowing toward the kind of institutional care that would complete the destruction that Rebecca's death had begun. Her unique combination of medical training, military understanding, and personal trauma experience made her the only candidate who might succeed where 15 others had failed. The collision between Sarah's healing needs and the twins' desperate requirements was building toward either breakthrough or breakdown, with 3 wounded souls whose recovery would depend on their ability to trust each other enough to begin the hardest battle any of them had ever fought. The interview took place in the wreckage of what had once been a perfectly appointed living room, with Emma and Ethan watching from their couch-cushioned fortress, while their grandmother, Margaret Eldridge, attempted to explain why the twins needed someone special rather than just competent. The euphemisms were careful but transparent. These children required someone who understood that traditional childcare methods had been shattered along with their sense of safety and stability. "Sarah, I'll be honest with you," Margaret said, with the exhausted candor of someone who'd watched her son's family disintegrate while he fought overseas. Emma and Ethan aren't just grieving, they're traumatized in ways that most people can't comprehend. Rebecca's death broke something in them that babysitters and daycare centers can't fix. Sarah's response revealed both professional expertise and personal understanding that most caregivers couldn't provide. "Mrs. Eldridge, I've worked with trauma victims who'd been through experiences that left them unable to trust anyone. Children process grief differently than adults, but the underlying needs are similar: safety, consistency, and someone who understands that healing isn't linear." The conversation was interrupted by Emma's emergence from the fortress, her 6-year-old face carrying the kind of hyper-vigilant assessment that Sarah recognized from soldiers who'd been in too many firefights. The little girl's evaluation was thorough and suspicious, her military child's instincts testing whether this new adult was another temporary solution or someone who might understand the complex rules that governed their damaged world. "Are you going to leave when we have bad dreams?" Emma asked with the directness that children use to cut through adult deception, her question revealing both the pattern of abandonment and the core fear that drove their defensive behaviors. "Mrs. Patterson said we were too much trouble, and Mrs. Rodriguez said we needed professional help." Sarah's answer was honest and military direct, acknowledging the children's trauma while establishing expectations that felt manageable rather than overwhelming. Emma, I'm not going to lie to you. Bad dreams are hard for everyone, but I've helped people with nightmares before, and I know some ways to make them less scary. I can't promise they'll go away, but I can promise I won't run away. The interaction that followed was Sarah's first test as the twins evaluated whether her words matched her actions when faced with the behaviors that had driven away every previous caregiver. Ethan's sudden explosion over a minor disagreement about snack choices escalated into the kind of full-scale meltdown that had convinced most babysitters that the children were beyond help. But Sarah's response was different. Instead of trying to stop the tantrum or becoming overwhelmed by its intensity, she positioned herself within visual range while maintaining calm authority that suggested she'd handled worse situations than angry 6-year-olds. Her military training had taught her to remain functional under pressure, while her medical experience provided understanding of how trauma manifested in behavioral dysregulation. Ethan, I can see you're really upset about something, and that's okay, Sarah said, in the kind of steady voice that cut through emotional chaos without adding to it. When you're ready to talk, I'll be right here. I'm not going anywhere. Her positioning was strategic, close enough to provide security, but far enough away to avoid triggering claustrophobic responses that had made other caregivers feel threatening rather than helpful. The de-escalation that followed demonstrated skills that went beyond normal childcare training, with Sarah recognizing the signs of trauma-triggered dysregulation while implementing techniques that military medics used for psychological first aid. Her approach combined professional competence with genuine empathy, creating exactly the kind of environment that traumatized children needed but rarely received. Margaret's observation of the interaction provided her first hope in months that someone might actually be able to help her grandchildren. Sarah, I don't know what you've been through, but you handle them differently than anyone else has. They're still testing you, but they're not trying to make you leave. The foundation was being laid for a therapeutic relationship that would challenge all three participants to confront trauma that civilian life had never prepared them to handle alone. The first week revealed the depth of the twins' trauma through behaviors that had overwhelmed every previous caregiver, but Sarah's military medical training allowed her to recognize patterns that civilian babysitters had interpreted as deliberate defiance rather than trauma responses. Emma's middle-of-the-night room checks weren't attention-seeking, but hypervigilance that made her verify that everyone was still alive and safe, while Ethan's explosive reactions to unexpected noises reflected combat-like startle responses that his 6-year-old nervous system couldn't regulate. They're not bad kids, they're scared kids, Sarah explained to Margaret during their evening debriefing, her clinical assessment providing context that transformed frustrating behaviors into understandable symptoms. Emma's checking on everyone because she's terrified of losing another person, and Ethan's anger is how he expresses feelings that are too big for his vocabulary. The breakthrough came when Sarah implemented military-style structure that provided predictability without feeling punitive, her approach combining the security that traumatized children needed with the flexibility that allowed them to maintain some control over their environment. Morning formations became fun rituals where the twins reported their mission status for the day, while evening debriefings allowed them to process experiences without feeling interrogated. about their emotions. "Sergeant Emma, what's your mission status?" Sarah would ask during their morning routine, her military bearing making the children feel important rather than managed. "Are you ready for Operation Breakfast and the great adventure of getting dressed without major casualties?" The humor was gentle but consistent, transforming routine tasks into manageable challenges rather than opportunities for conflict. But the twins' testing escalated as they began to trust Sarah enough to reveal the depth of their damage, their behaviors becoming more extreme as they unconsciously sought to discover whether this adult would abandon them like all the others. Ethan's tantrums intensified while Emma's anxiety manifested in compulsive behaviors that included repeated hand washing and checking rituals that consumed hours of their day. The crisis came during the twins' second week when Ethan discovered a cardboard box in the garage containing his mother's belongings that hadn't been packed away, triggering a psychological breakdown that was beyond anything Sarah had witnessed in her civilian caregiving experience. His screaming was primal and devastating, the sound of a child's heart breaking all over again as he clutched a sweater that still smelled like Rebecca's perfume. Sarah's response drew on every aspect of her military medical training as she recognized that Ethan was experiencing the kind of traumatic flashback that required immediate intervention to prevent psychological damage. Her approach was both professional and maternal, providing physical security while allowing him to process emotions that had been suppressed for months. "Ethan, you're safe, and I've got you," Sarah said as she held him through convulsions of grief that seemed too large for his small body. "Missing your mom hurts so much it feels like dying, but you're not alone, and you're going to be okay." Her words were simple but medically informed, acknowledging the reality of his pain while providing hope that healing was possible. Emma's reaction to her brother's breakdown revealed her own trauma responses. As she became hyper-vigilant and protective, positioning herself to guard the exits while monitoring Sarah's reactions to determine whether this crisis would drive away another caregiver. Her 6-year-old brain was already calculating abandonment scenarios while her body prepared for fight-or-flight responses that had become automatic. But Sarah's handling of the crisis was different from anything the twins had experienced. Instead of becoming overwhelmed or trying to minimize their emotions, she stayed present and functional while providing the kind of steady support that allowed them to process feelings that had been too dangerous to express with previous caregivers who might have been frightened away by the intensity of their pain. The evening that followed became a turning point as Sarah shared carefully chosen details about her own experiences with loss and trauma. Her vulnerability creating space for the children to understand that healing was possible even after devastating experiences. Her approach was therapeutic rather than confessional, providing hope without burdening them with adult problems they couldn't solve. "I lost friends when I was a soldier, and sometimes I still have nightmares about it," Sarah told them during their bedtime routine, her honesty creating connection without overwhelming them with details they couldn't process. "But I learned that having sad feelings doesn't mean being sad forever, and missing people we love is how we honor them even when they can't be with us." The twins' response was cautious, but engaged their questions, revealing intelligence and emotional sophistication that had been hidden beneath their defensive behaviors. They were beginning to understand that Sarah wasn't just another babysitter, but someone who truly comprehended the landscape of loss and recovery that they were navigating together. But what Sarah hadn't anticipated was how caring for the twins would trigger her own unresolved trauma responses, their healing journey forcing her to confront PTSD symptoms that she'd been suppressing through professional competence and emotional numbing. The nightmares that had been manageable were intensifying while her own hypervigilance was being triggered by the children's need for constant security and reassurance. The realization was dawning that healing would have to be mutual. The twins needed her military training and trauma expertise, but she needed their trust and hope to begin addressing wounds that her own service had left unhealed. The crisis erupted during the twins' third week, when Sarah's own PTSD symptoms, triggered by weeks of intense caregiving and emotional vulnerability, manifested in a severe panic attack that occurred while she was supposed to be providing security and stability for children whose world had already collapsed once. The attack began during what should have been routine bedtime, with Sarah's hypervigilance suddenly shifting from protective awareness to overwhelming sensory overload that made her feel like she was back in Afghanistan during a mortar attack. I need to, Sarah gasped as she struggled with breathing that had become rapid and shallow, her military composure dissolving as combat memories merged with present circumstances in ways that made distinguishing between past and present impossible. The woman who had treated panic attacks in soldiers was now experiencing the full force of trauma that she'd been suppressing for 3 years through professional competence and emotional numbing. Emma and Ethan's reaction to Sarah's breakdown revealed how deeply their previous losses had affected them. Instead of seeking help or running away, both children moved into protective mode that demonstrated their premature understanding of adult vulnerability and their terror of losing another caregiver. Their 6-year-old minds immediately began calculating whether Sarah's distress meant abandonment was coming. "Sarah, please don't leave us," Emma whispered as she positioned herself between Sarah and the door, her hypervigilance now focused on preventing another adult from disappearing from their lives. "We'll be good, we promise. We won't have any more tantrums." Her words carried the desperate bargaining that traumatized children used when they believed their behavior controlled adult decisions. Ethan's response was more direct, but equally revealing, as he brought Sarah a glass of water and the weighted blanket that helped him during his own panic episodes, his instinctive caregiving demonstrating emotional intelligence that had been developed through necessity rather than natural development. His approach was gentle but determined, channeling protective instincts that no 6-year-old should have needed to develop. The darkest moment came when Sarah realized that her breakdown was re-traumatizing children who had already experienced more loss than most adults could handle. Her professional responsibility to provide stability, competing with personal vulnerability that she could no longer suppress or control. The guilt was overwhelming. She was supposed to be healing these children, not adding to their trauma through her own psychological damage. I'm so sorry," Sarah sobbed as she fought to regain control while recognizing that her symptoms were creating exactly the kind of adult instability that had defined the twins' experience since their mother's death. "You shouldn't have to take care of me. That's not your job." Her words reflected both professional shame and personal devastation at failing children who had trusted her with their recovery. But the twins' response revealed resilience and wisdom that transformed the crisis from complete breakdown to breakthrough opportunity. Instead of rejecting Sarah for her vulnerability, they recognized something familiar in her distress and responded with the kind of empathy that trauma survivors developed through shared experience of loss and fear. Sometimes grown-ups have bad dreams too, Emma said with startling insight as she carefully positioned herself beside Sarah, her approach cautious but determined. When we have nightmares, you stay with us. We can stay with you too. Her offer was both generous and strategic, providing comfort while ensuring that the adult who understood them wouldn't disappear. The healing that began in that moment was mutual and profound as Sarah recognized that her vulnerability wasn't damaging the children, but teaching them that recovery was possible even for adults whose strength had limits and whose pain was real. The therapeutic relationship that had been one-directional was becoming reciprocal, with all three participants learning that healing required both giving and receiving support. The conversation that followed was honest in ways that transformed their relationship from caregiver children to fellow survivors who could support each other through trauma that none of them could handle alone. Sarah's admission that she had been struggling with her own nightmares and anxiety gave the twins permission to acknowledge that healing wasn't linear and that setbacks didn't mean failure. "We're all kind of broken," Ethan observed with matter-of-fact clarity that cut through adult euphemisms to essential truth. "But maybe broken people can help fix each other." His words carried wisdom that exceeded his years while providing hope that their shared damage could become shared strength. The night that followed was different from any they had experienced together, with Sarah sleeping on the couch, while Emma and Ethan took turns checking on her the way she had been monitoring their sleep for weeks. The role reversal was therapeutic for children who needed to feel useful and protective while demonstrating that trust could survive vulnerability and that strength could emerge from shared weakness. The crisis had revealed that healing required authenticity rather than professional competence, and that the strongest therapeutic relationships were those built on mutual understanding rather than one-way expertise. The transformation began the morning after Sarah's breakdown, when she made the conscious decision to approach her own healing with the same systematic methodology she'd been using to help the twins, recognizing that her recovery and theirs were interconnected in ways that traditional caregiver relationships couldn't accommodate. Her military training provided structure for addressing trauma, but the twins' resilience and wisdom would provide the emotional foundation that made healing possible. "We need to have a family meeting," Sarah announced during breakfast, her use of the word family deliberate and meaningful for children whose sense of belonging had been shattered by loss and abandonment. "All three of us are dealing with scary feelings and bad memories, and I think we can help each other get better if we work together like a team." The conversation that followed was unprecedented in its honesty and age-appropriate transparency, with Sarah sharing carefully chosen details about her combat experiences while helping the twins understand that PTSD wasn't weakness, but injury that required treatment, like any physical wound. Her approach combined medical education with emotional support, creating understanding that reduced stigma while building hope. "When I was a soldier, I saw friends get hurt in ways that gave me nightmares and made me feel scared even when I was safe. Sarah explained with the kind of clinical clarity that made complex concepts manageable for 6-year-old minds. Just like how your hearts hurt when your mom died, my brain got hurt by things I saw in the war. But hurt doesn't mean broken forever. It means we need help healing. Emma's response revealed emotional intelligence that had been hidden beneath her defensive behaviors. Her questions demonstrating understanding that adult healing could model recovery for children who had lost hope. If you can get better from soldier hurt, does that mean we can get better from mom hurt? Her inquiry was both personal and profound, seeking reassurance that trauma wasn't permanent while offering to participate in mutual recovery. The therapeutic approach that emerged was collaborative rather than hierarchical, with all 3 participants acknowledging their wounds while committing to support each other through healing that would require patient setbacks and the kind of trust that had to be rebuilt daily. Sarah's military structure provided framework, but the twins' courage and resilience provided motivation that transformed clinical treatment into family mission. The implementation was both systematic and creative, with morning check-ins that allowed everyone to assess their emotional status, while evening debriefs processed the day's challenges and victories. The military terminology made serious conversations feel manageable while providing vocabulary that helped all 3 participants articulate feelings that had previously been overwhelming or inexpressible. Operation Healing is Go became their morning rallying cry, with each family member reporting their mission readiness while identifying potential challenges and support needs for the day ahead. The structure created predictability while allowing flexibility for setbacks that were treated as temporary tactical adjustments rather than strategic failures. But the most meaningful progress came through small daily victories that demonstrated healing was happening even when progress felt invisible or insufficient. Ethan's tantrums became less frequent and shorter in duration, while Emma's hypervigilance transformed from constant anxiety into protective awareness that felt manageable rather than overwhelming. Sarah's own recovery accelerated through the responsibility and purpose that caring for the twins provided, her nightmares becoming less frequent, while her sense of meaning expanded beyond professional competence to encompass the kind of maternal connection she'd never expected to experience. The children's trust and dependency created structure that made her own healing feel urgent rather than optional. The breakthrough came 6 weeks into their partnership, when all 3 successfully navigated a crisis that would have been overwhelming earlier in their relationship, a severe thunderstorm that triggered trauma responses in everyone while providing an opportunity to implement coping strategies together rather than individually. The storm created the perfect testing ground for skills they'd been developing. "Emergency protocol activated," Sarah announced, as thunder triggered Ethan's startled response and lightning made Emma begin her compulsive checking behaviors. All personnel to the safe room for Operation Weather Warrior. Her calm authority provided stability, while their prepared response plan made chaos feel manageable rather than terrifying. The safe room they'd created in the basement became their command center, equipped with comfort items, communication devices, and the kind of sensory management tools that helped all 3 family members regulate their nervous systems during high-stress situations. The preparation made them feel empowered rather than victimized by circumstances beyond their control. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah experienced anxiety symptoms during the storm, and the twins immediately implemented the support strategies they'd learned, their coordinated response demonstrating that healing had become mutual and that strength could flow in all directions within their chosen family unit. Deep breaths, Emma coached with perfect technique, while Ethan retrieved the weighted blanket and positioned himself for contact comfort that provided grounding without feeling overwhelming. "We've got you. You're safe with us." Their competence and compassion proved that trauma survivors could become healers when given proper tools and supportive relationships. The storm passed with all three family members feeling successful rather than defeated, their shared coping strategies having created connection rather than isolation during a situation that would have been devastating earlier in their relationship. The victory was both practical and emotional, proving that their unconventional family structure was actually their greatest strength. The community's recognition of their transformation was gradual but meaningful, with neighbors and military families observing changes that went beyond behavioral improvement to encompass genuine happiness and security that radiated from their household. The Eldridge house was no longer known for chaos, but for the kind of quiet success that inspired hope in other military families dealing with deployment stress and trauma. The letter that arrived from James Eldridge 6 months into Sarah's employment was both grateful and wondering, his overseas communication revealing amazement at reports of children who were thriving rather than merely surviving. "Sarah, I don't know how you've accomplished what 15 others couldn't, but my mother says the kids are different, happier, calmer, more like themselves than they've been since Rebecca died. Whatever you're doing, it's working miracles." Sarah's response was honest about the mutual healing that had made their success possible. "Sergeant Eldridge, your children didn't need fixing. They needed understanding and someone who recognized that trauma healing works best when everyone involved is committed to recovery. Emma and Ethan have taught me as much about resilience as I've taught them about coping, and we're all stronger together than any of us were alone." The annual evaluation meeting with Margaret Eldridge became a celebration rather than assessment, with behavioral improvements documented alongside emotional growth that exceeded what any professional intervention had achieved. The children's test scores, sleep patterns, and social interactions all reflected healing that was comprehensive rather than superficial. "I honestly thought we might lose them," Margaret admitted during the meeting, her words carrying the weight of someone who'd watched trauma destroy families while fearing that her grandchildren were beyond help. "But you didn't just save Emma and Ethan, you gave them back their childhood while giving yourself a family. That's not a job, that's a calling." The final scene was both ending and beginning, as the three family members stood together at the airport, waiting for James Eldridge's return from deployment, with confidence that they'd built something strong enough to survive reunion and reintegration. The healing they'd accomplished together had prepared them for the next phase of their journey as an unconventional but unbreakable family unit. "Remember," Sarah told the twins as they prepared to meet their father, "we're still a team, and teams stick together no matter what changes. Your dad's coming home to a family that's stronger than when he left, and that's something to be proud of." The Eldridge family's transformation became a model for military childcare and trauma intervention, demonstrating that unconventional healing approaches could succeed where traditional methods had failed, while proving that mutual recovery was often more effective than one-directional treatment. Sarah's innovative combination of military structure and therapeutic vulnerability influenced childcare practices throughout military communities and civilian trauma programs. The immediate consequences revolutionized how Camp Lejeune approached childcare for military families dealing with deployment stress and trauma, with Sarah's methods being incorporated into family readiness group training and base childcare protocols. Her success inspired the creation of a veteran-to-veteran childcare program that matched military families with veteran caregivers who understood deployment stress and trauma responses. The psychological research that documented the family's recovery contributed to academic understanding of childhood PTSD and the effectiveness of peer healing models, where caregivers and children supported each other's recovery. The findings influenced treatment approaches at Walter Reed Medical Center and VA family programs, while validating therapeutic relationships that transcended traditional hierarchies. The military community impact was substantial and lasting, with other installations adopting similar programs that connected veteran caregivers with military families experiencing trauma-related childcare challenges. The model reduced reliance on civilian services that often lacked understanding of military culture, while creating employment opportunities for veterans whose skills were perfectly suited for supporting military families. The broader child care industry recognized Sarah's approach as breakthrough methodology for trauma-informed care, with her techniques being taught in early childhood education programs and adopted by therapeutic childcare centers serving at-risk populations. The integration of military structure with emotional vulnerability became standard practice for programs serving children with complex trauma histories. The federal policy impact included enhanced funding for military family support programs and veteran employment initiatives that recognized the unique qualifications that military experience provided for childcare and trauma intervention roles. The Department of Defense expanded programs that connected veteran caregivers with military families while providing specialized training that built on military experience. The James Eldridge family's successful reintegration after deployment became a case study for how proper support during deployment could strengthen rather than strain military families, with their experience influencing pre-deployment training and family preparation programs. Their story demonstrated that trauma could be healed rather than merely managed when supported by proper resources and understanding. The cultural transformation challenged assumptions about military families and trauma recovery, proving that resilience could be taught and that healing was possible even for severely traumatized children when provided with appropriate support and understanding. The family's success inspired broader conversations about veteran employment and the unique qualifications that military service provided for civilian helping professions. The annual Sarah Collins Award for Excellence in Military Family Support became the premier recognition for innovative approaches to military child care and family services, honoring caregivers who demonstrated exceptional understanding of military culture and trauma-informed practices. The award influenced professional development throughout military family services, while inspiring continued innovation in veteran-to-veteran support programs. The enduring message transcended individual success to encompass fundamental truths about healing and family trauma recovery, was most effective when mutual and collaborative military experience provided unique qualifications for understanding and treating deployment-related stress, and the strongest families were often those formed through shared struggle rather than biological connection alone.